Number 1. Trick, not treat. I grew up in a very rural area. I was the oldest of 4 children, and we all grew up our entire childhood on a house out in the hills. We ended up doing a lot of stuff outside because of this, including exploring. We did have a pretty strange tradition, though. There were other houses out in the hills with us, but they didn't have any kids. They were all inhabited by older people. The tradition that I was speaking of was related to the houses with the older people. We would drive into town to do trick-or-treating for Halloween. However, when we were finished doing this, we came home and took a stroll down the hills to go to the other houses. It was quite a walk, and it was dark as hell. There were no street lights out there, of course. Still, the old folks who lived in those houses expected us to show up every Halloween night. They would bake cookies and such for us, and these were the only non-packaged trick-or-treat food that we were allowed to keep. I had been driving since I was 12 years old. Everyone learned to drive in my family at a pretty young age. However, this was only in the hills. I wasn't allowed to drive into town until I turned 16 years old. Once that happened, though, I was the one who drove the younger kids into town for Halloween. This was back when daylight saving time was still in October, so, of course, it got darker out earlier. Plus, we always did trick-or-treat in the dark back then, too. The point being that it was dark, and had been dark the entire time. Now, if it had been up to me, I would have just taken the car and driven to all the houses. But the kids loved their tradition of taking the walk, so I had to go ahead and go with them. I had been doing this as the oldest for several years by that point, as my parents were often working on Halloween. It is probably just my memory thinking weird about it, but it seemed like it was even darker than usual this night. But we kept going, and as usual, we were a little scared. But it was Halloween, so that was sort of the point. We got to all the houses no problem, and then we were coming home. I couldn't wait myself because I wanted to spend some time by myself. "Hey, there was someone out in the woods," I heard my little sister say. She grabbed my arm and began pointing out there. I took my flashlight and shined it where she was pointing. I thought I saw something moving, but it was only momentary. There could have been anything. I let her know it was nothing to worry about, and we would be home soon. We kept walking until she saw it again. I shined my flashlight again. This time I was able to see a humanoid figure for a split second, but I wasn't able to make out any features. It moved behind a tree way too quickly. I called out, asking who it was and what they wanted, but I didn't get an answer. I cautiously tried to hurry the kids along to get them home. I was feeling nervous now, because whoever was out there was acting weird. That couldn't end up being good. As we were walking, I heard a loud gunshot go out in the woods. This really freaked the children out, and I was worried. I shined the flashlight out in the woods again. This time, I saw the person out there, before they moved out of my eyesight. I have no idea if they were the one who fired the gun, but I didn't really want to find out. We were all scared and wanted to get home. Now I kept hearing sounds out in the woods, and it sounded like there was maybe more than one person out there. I was seriously fearing for our safety. I got a little more unnerved when I noticed there was a car coming up behind us. We got off to the side of the road, and I kept the flashlight on, even though I didn't know what to expect from the car. However, when it appeared, it ended up being one of the seniors that we trick-or-treated with. I told him something weird was going on, and asked if he could give us a ride home, which he was more than willing to do. Sitting in the passenger seat, I turned and looked into the woods for a moment, and shined my flashlight out the window. 3 large and intimidating men were standing in the woods and watching us. All 3 of them had guns, and were wearing what seemed to be Halloween masks. We got home safe, and I told my dad about what had happened. We were worried about some lunatics hanging out in the woods, but there wasn't much we could do about it. My dad just made sure he had his gun with him in case something happened, but thankfully it didn't. And think even more that the older man was there to help out. Why 3 men would be hanging out with guns and Halloween masks in the woods at night, that's beyond me. Number 2. A Halloween Snowball Effect. Flashback to 1997. I was 15 years old and living on a semi-rural stretch of property. Here's how it was set up. We were living in a newer 3-bedroom ranch-style house at the front of the property, and at the back was a single-wide trailer my mother, brother, and I lived in while the house was being built. It was Halloween, and unfortunately for my brother and I, one that we would not get a chance to really enjoy, due to the fact that my mother could not get off work that night, and my brother was sick with strep throat. How did he end up with strep, you might ask? The school bully. This kid, who I will call Jay for the sake of the story, was an absolute hellion. He didn't have many friends, and it wasn't due to lack of effort. The kid got off on making people miserable. My brother, who is legally blind without his glasses, was sitting in the lunchroom and eating, when suddenly someone slapped him in the back of the head from behind, causing his glasses to fall off. The person walked away laughing, and once he got his glasses on, he realized it was Jay. He said he muttered a few curse words under his breath, and went back to drinking his chocolate milk. It wasn't until after he was done with the carton, one of the girls sitting across from his table realized he not only drank the milk, but finished it. This is when she got up and told him Jay had spit in his drink. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out who the patient zero was, because he ended up being sent home later on in the day by the school nurse. So now I'm babysitting my 12-year-old brother, and thanks to a last-minute run to our local pharmacy, I'm handing out a meager amount of trick-or-treats to the kids. All the while I'm doing this, my brother is in his room, watching horror flicks and feeling miserable. It's just about 10 o'clock, and I've ended up handing out the last bit of candy, so I turn off my porch light to indicate we have nothing left to give. I check on my brother, and he's about halfway through the Lost Boys when he turns and asks me to make him a cup of green tea with honey. Not a problem, I remarked to him, and I go about doing so. But before I could grab the mug, my Boston Terrier I had at the time is doing her pee-pee dance, so I let her out in the backyard. I make him his cup of tea, and as I'm stirring the honey, I hear my dog barking frantically. This isn't anything unusual. In her mind, she was a 100-pound dog trapped in a 20-pound body. Birds, foxes, stray cats, anything was fair game to her, despite the fact that she would yelp and cower in fear should any of those things confront her back. I'm not thinking anything of it at first, but then my brother starts screaming. My initial thought was, okay, the Lost Boys isn't even that scary. Even the campfire scene is kinda campy in its own right. It's only when I get to his bedroom that I see him looking out the window and attempting to scream my name with a faded, sickly voice. I get into his room. I notice this orange flicker dancing on the walls. It's coming from his window, which overlooked the backyard. I move him out of the way as quickly as possible, and when I look in the direction of the trailer, I can see it's absolutely engulfed in flames. My dog is going absolutely nuts and barking at everything. I call her inside, and surprisingly, she listened to me and hid behind the couch. The next thing I know, I'm on the phone with 911, practically begging them to get a fire unit out to my property. It felt like forever, but it couldn't have been any longer than 5 minutes when a tanker truck and an ambulance show up. Thankfully, there was no need for the ambulance, but that fire completely destroyed the trailer. Little known fact, those trailers are tinder boxes, and it doesn't take much for a fire to completely consume one. As the firefighters are doing their best to contain the blaze, I'm on the phone with my mother, begging her to leave work early and explaining the situation. Of course, this wasn't a problem. She ended up home within half an hour. As the firefighters came to the front of the house to explain that they had put out the blaze, they mentioned that the police were on their way because they noticed that telltale smell of gasoline all over the place. I remember my mother talking to the cops, and they're asking her if we had anybody in our lives that would want to do us harm. We couldn't think of anybody. My mother was a well-liked member of the community. I had a paper route, so most of my neighbors knew me. And as far as my brother was concerned, he was a quiet kid, with a small circle of friends. I'll admit it, he was a bit nerdy too. I personally couldn't see any of his friends doing anything worse than forgetting to bring some Doritos to one of their D&D sessions. It wasn't until a few days later, the two of us are at school and we see Jay. His eyebrows appeared to be cinched off, and his right hand was bandaged up. Without thinking, I walked up to him and asked him what the deal was. He looked at me with a smirk and a sadistic grin, and he didn't even hide it. Like you even have to ask. He starts laughing, and I don't know what came over me. Perhaps it was the fact that the trailer that was burned down was in need of very little repairs. A bit of linoleum in the kitchen, a new coat of paint on the interior, some minor cleaning, nothing big. It was going to be a rental as soon as the weather warmed up a little bit, and my mother was able to hire someone to come out and take care of those things. This would have meant that she would be home more often, and would be able to quit her second job. Now that was off the table, and it was all thanks to this reprehensible chode. But the next thing I knew could only be described as an out-of-body experience. I knew it was going on, but I had no control over my actions. I ended up grabbing his burned wrist and squeezing it with all of my might. As he stood there practically paralyzed and wincing in pain, I hit him with several square punches to the mouth and the bridge of his nose. I'm raining in blows, and the next thing I know, a couple of students and a teacher have to pull me off of him. He gets up and he's bleeding from the mouth, and suddenly the tough guy persona is gone. He's crying like a baby and swearing he's gonna get revenge. I'm pulled into the principal's office alongside of him, but the school had a zero-tolerance policy when it came down to fighting. I wasn't even given a chance to explain my side of the story. I am being admonished by the principal, and he's honestly shocked because, up until that point, the worst thing I'd ever done was forget to bring a doctor's note after showing up late. But looking back on it, I still feel that if that 1 week suspension was absolutely worth it. It's during this suspension, however, I'm experiencing the joy of groundation and forced to watch whatever my mother wanted to watch on her day off. It was sometime after 11 a.m., and I was learning that in the rare instances my mother had off from both jobs, and my brother and I were in school, she would hate watch Judge Judy. I'm sitting in the living room with her trying not to laugh at the sight, and suddenly we get a knock at the door. My mom let out an exasperated sigh, mainly because she thought it was more than likely Jehovah's Witnesses, or the guy who worked for Schwann's, trying to get her to buy overpriced root beer float popsicles. But when she gets to the door and looks through the window, she turns back and immediately starts yelling at me. "Oh, this is great. You just had to put your hands on that kid." It's all she says before opening the door. I get up off the recliner I was sitting in and looked over my mom's shoulder. There, standing on our front porch, are two of the police officers who were investigating the fire, and a plain-clothed, conservatively dressed woman. She wasn't much older than my mom, and when she spoke, I realized who she was. It was Jay's aunt. She had a reputation around town for being a really religious busybody, and I fully expected her to say she was at my house with these two officers, ready to press assault charges on me. My assumption was wrong, but what she said next absolutely blew my mother and I away. So, apparently when Jay went back to school, he told everybody who asked he stood too close to a bonfire when one of his friends threw a can of spray paint into it. As mentioned before, that really couldn't be the case because he didn't have any friends to speak of, due to the way he carried himself. CPS came by, and he ended up telling the social worker the same story, just to get her out of the house. Of course, things didn't line up. His aunt was quite suspicious, and when she repeatedly pressed him on the matter, he owned up to everything. Not only had he owned up to everything, he bragged about it. He said his only regret was that he didn't have enough kerosene to put a trail leading to the house. This is when his aunt did the right thing and called the police. Jay was at school at this point, and so she was going to follow the officers to the school while they picked him up. But first she wanted to come by the house and let us know what she had learned. She was incredibly apologetic and thankful none of us were hurt. I'm not too sure off the top of my head how much time went by, but it wasn't a long time frame. We were in court and Jay sat there in cuffs all the while, shooting us a death glare. The look on his face was palpable when his own aunt came clean about what she had been told. We, of course, corroborated the story and even expressed ourselves how lucky we were that he wasn't smart enough to cover his tracks. He ended up being sentenced to a lengthy sentence at the juvenile detention center 3 counties over. He was also ordered to pay for a large portion of the damages he caused, and we figured that would be it. It wasn't, unfortunately for him. When he got out, he was 16. He was still on probation and would be until the age of 18. By now, the town knew what he was capable of, so he'd become somewhat of a social pariah. Nobody thought he was tough anymore, just stupid. And he would prove everybody right one late November night when he would break into someone's garage in order to steal an ATV. He successfully hotwired it, opened the garage door, and sped off as the owner came out of the garage door leading into the house with a shotgun loaded full of rock salt. Zay got off a shot as he was speeding away, and he managed to end up with a good portion of the rock salt in his lower back. From what we were told by some eyewitnesses to the event, he kept going, and eventually a police car caught up with him. He tried to outrun the police, but due to either the pain, the fact the road had frozen over, or due to some rain earlier in the day, or both, he would lose control of the ATV, fishtail a bit, and the vehicle would roll over on top of him. His injuries were severe, and he didn't make it to the hospital. Despite the fact he did what he did, I couldn't stop thinking about his aunt. She only turned in her nephew because she loved him, and she had hoped it would be a wake-up call. Unfortunately for Jay, there was no waking up from this permanent consequence, and now his aunt was going to be burying her teenage nephew and her last link to any of the family she had at the time. So, before I get going, I want everyone to realize that actions have consequences. I know it's an overused expression, but it's so much more true than anybody gives it credit for, and ignoring one of the most important life lessons anybody can learn is what cost my brother's school bully his life. Number 3. I've been binge watching your videos on my long days driving for Grubhub, and was happy to see your email for submitting stories. Most of mine are paranormal. I don't want to overwhelm your schedule with too many, so I'll start with one. This happened in 1992. You wouldn't think such a small basement apartment that was more like a dollhouse would be haunted. It has an open room for the living room and kitchen, and 2 even smaller rooms for the bedroom and bathroom. I lived there for about 5 months. The first incident happened in November, just a month after I moved in. I was awakened by a long black, man-shaped swirling mass just inches from my face. It had no face, but moved his head like he was looking back and forth between my face and my body. He also made motions with his bottom half, like he was trying to have sex with me, but I couldn't feel it. I screamed at this thing to get off of me, and he flew backwards into the wall that was behind him, till he quickly faded to a smaller gray shadow. Years later, when I watched the Entity movie about the woman assaulted by a demon or evil ghost in California, it was all too familiar. Later I found out from my landlord that some guy had offed himself in that house, and now I was stuck with it. Nothing else happened until 3 weeks later. This manifestation was even more disturbing because it was solid. Again he woke me up sitting on my bed. He leaned over me, and I could feel my feet rolling into his weight. I woke up in a panic and no one was there. I also felt an angry presence in my room shortly before that, so I knew something was going to happen, and I thought, that's it, I'm out of here, and I moved out a month later. Cliffhanger. This may have been the same young guy who had killed 2 women, then himself the year before, in an apartment I had lived in before that. I'd been there when I saw the bodies being carried out, and then my landlady told me. There's more to that story next time. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. First I want to wish everybody a happy Halloween. And then I'd like to thank all my paid Patreon subscribers, starting with my 2 VIPs, Pixie Hopper 8 and Chiamerah Cat. I also like to thank Kelli Clark, Stinking Ooze, EricaOdd, Tracy Sellars, Chronic J, and Heidi H. I hope everyone is having a great Halloween, and I know the last story didn't really fit into the country Halloween theme, but it was a story that I really liked and wanted to include in here, and I figured since it's a ghost story it would be appropriate for Halloween anyways. So please let me know how you're doing in the comments and if you're having a good Halloween. In the meantime, if you like the video, let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please hit the subscribe button and the bell so you'll be notified of new videos. Leave me a comment, which I will do my best to get back to, and share the video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you would like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please send it to the address in the description. And now I'd like to mention all my free Patreon subscribers: Hicks, Lisa Herman, Anthony Bowers, Remi, Venikins, Rose Metro, Woofer McWooferson, Cindy Cleveland, Vanapira Rayne, William H., Alien Unicorn 13, Kathryn Lynch, The Bama Guy 334, Michael Vasquez, Bonnie Lynn, Collet Bond, Krista Pike, Prince UVA, HF Creations, Bonnie Gibbs, Linda Moore, DJ Lira, and Evil Black Cat. And most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where Halloween Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night. Happy Halloween.